Hi there, it's Marcus again, week one, kind of lecture one. I'm calling it lecture one because that's the way I still think. I'm programmed by decades of teaching and lecturing. But of course, I'm working at home. I'm talking to myself. Well, there's a picture of Buddha over there and a couple of my friends and my son up on the wall. But yes, I'm stuck in my little room, enjoying the news that COVID is now a national emergency. It's the Delta variant keeps on ticking along. In New South Wales. It doesn't seem to be going anywhere fast in terms of away. World history. It's part of the incredible dilemmas that we face today because we are a global community now. And COVID, of course, makes this very clear. But, you know, if you step back a little bit and you look at the total disregard that the environment and the weather and climate have for national boundaries, political persuasions and so on, we can see that there's a lot in the mix. And that lot in the mix needs to be thought about. And we need able and capable citizens to think clearly about what's going on in order to make hopefully well-informed, thoughtful decisions in terms of our choices about our lives and where we choose to go as communities of engaged citizens. History forces us to be engaged. It's not something any longer that we can treat dispassionately. You know, as a youth, I studied medieval British history and I was living in Perth in WA. You know, it was far away and it was almost like Lord of the Rings or something like that. It was something that was other to me, but it was still deeply entrancing because, of course, as a historian, you know, I have a love of the past and I have a love of the mysteries that the past evokes. Okay. And I'm sure many of you are here because you have a similar love of the past and we all love our own various pasts. Some people are, you know, really up on sports history. Others know every single tank used by the Germans in the Second World War. I had a student like that about 6 years ago. It was just an absolute font of information around that one very specific area. For me, you know, my love did grow out of early European and medieval history, but then it kind of exploded into global perspectives when I became an educator because I studied education as well. So there's a little bit of bio here for me. As a musician, classical musician, so it was very much European music at first, but the discovery of world music in the late 70s, early 80s, both world music in terms of other cultures, but also the music of other times. So it was the beginning of what you might call the medieval music renaissance that was led from the 60s into the 70s. And you had wonderful, young, dynamic, highly scholarly approaches to unpacking what medieval and early European music sounded like, for instance. It's quite amazing, and it's gone a long way since then, of course. But, you know, this was all happening. And then I ended up traveling through Asia and spending a lot of time in India and places like that, which again turned my sensitivities to the world upside down. And of course, as an observer and as a teacher and as an academic, I've become more and more aware of the global nature of all historical processes. And that's made it richer for me. It's deepened my love of the past, but it's also deepened my commitment to the future. Most of my academic and scholarly work actually is in the area of futures or futures thinking. If you look me up in the library or you Google me or you put my name into Google Scholar, you'll find, or you can look up my own website too. I have one which is very poorly maintained, I have to admit, because I don't have time, but it's called futuresevocative.net. You can go and have a look and see what this slightly eccentric old lecture is on about. But to me, it's about a global conversation, and it's about equipping young people, particularly, but you know, all of us, because I know that not only young people are doing this course, but it's a first year course, for engagement with the world around us, but with a new set of lenses. And these lenses come from these big ideas that I talked about in the intro lectures, and also on the getting started, where we've got energy, complexity, and collective learning. So I'm having this conversation in a sense with myself, but I'm also having it still with you, one-on-one, because we're all sitting now at our computers, one-on-one, and we're going to explore this thing called world history. I'm going to start off now by pulling up the PowerPoint that I've got prepared for you, and I'm going to do a reasonably quick sprint through this, and then Gil, Rosie, and I will pick it all up in the lectures, right? In the tutorials, I mean. And I'm going to see if I can drag this across here. So otherwise, I'm going to constantly be looking over here. I have to keep looking over there. So first of all, a bit more of my own story. I can't escape weaving my story into the way I approach my teaching, for a start. And also, I have to say that all scholarship is deeply personal. Ultimately, it is propelled by our commitment to and our fascination with certain things, which are emotional things. It's not just an intellectual escapade that I'm taking you on. This is a journey about identity, because history is ultimately about who we are. So we have this incredible image here of it looks like a falling person. And I found this on a rock in West Sweden, just probably 30 or 40 kilometers south of the Norwegian border. And I was there exploring Vitlik, and which is a site of Bronze Age and early Iron Age rock sculptures. Petroglyphs is their technical term for them. Many of them had been identified, and the Swedish government actually paints into a lot of these so that they're more easily visible. But this one was on a rock on its own, somewhat off in the forest, and I just stumbled across it, and I just fell in love with it, because you can look at it either as a person falling, or if I inverted that, switched it around, it's a person jumping. And having seen many of the other ones now, I suspect it's actually a person jumping. But my first encounter with it was, it's like a falling angel, or it's like, if you know your Greek myths, Icarus, who had the wings made of wax and feathers, and he flew too close to the sun and he fell. Certainly something is falling in our world today. I think it's a vision of what human beings could be when we could control the world around us, the industrial technological vision of human supremacy over and domination over the planet. Of course, before that vision came the vision of Western Europeans being able to dominate and control the rest of the planet, that imperialist colonial vision. And before that, we've seen many civilizations foster the same vision: the ancient Greeks, the ancient Egyptians, the ancient Inca, the ancient Maya, and so on, the ancient Chinese, the Indo-Aryans, the Dravidians, the Mughals of India, all have had this illusion that we can control the world around us. And often they've managed to do this through violence. So to me, that vision is in decline. It's being deeply challenged by the advance of COVID, by climate change, and also a renewed set of trends, which I pointed you towards if you hopefully have gone and looked at them in the lecture or the introductory kind of talk that I put up about 4 days ago. So let me continue then. So what are we going to do? So I'm going to click onto this. First of all, I have to put up this, letting you know that the lecture is going to be recorded, but actually I'm just thinking about it. I stick this up always in week 1, but I don't need to anymore, because I'm not talking to anybody anymore other than myself. So I better warn myself that this lecture might be recorded. You know, I have a tendency of saying things that I shouldn't. And so I'm going to do my best not to say things that I shouldn't when I'm being recorded. But anyway, we'll skip over that, and I'm going to remove it from now on. Here we have a fascinating little clip, which I'm not going to click on, but I invite you to click on it when when you actually have the PowerPoint at your fingertips, once I've posted this lecture, which will go up probably this afternoon. It's Friday morning, the 23rd of July, in the year of our Lord 2021, Anno Domini. And here we have a fascinating timeline in which we can see the civilizations on the planet popping up and decline and disappearing over about a 60-second grab. What's really interesting is that these civilizations basically fall in the equatorial zone, okay? The early civilizations didn't appear up in Alaska or over there in the Siberian tundra, or down in the very south of South America, or in New Zealand, which is not on the map, or in Australia, and so on. It was through this equatorial belt, and that's really interesting. And to see the efflorescence is the term that we use in world history for the rise and fall of civilizations. And the one thing I wanted to say about that right now is that there are 5 autochthonous civilizations that evolved with no contact from other areas on the planet. So the Chinese civilization is totally unique to China. Of course, as soon as it started trading and the Silk Road opened up, it got in contact with other civilizations and so on. But, the Sumerian civilization, the Maya and the Olmec before them, well, the Maya grew up in the shadow of the Olmec, and others living in Central America and so on. So we have these 5 localized civilizations that grow up with quite unique characteristics. But the interesting thing, of course, is that as human beings become complex social beings, certain things seem to have appeared again and again. All these civilizations have order imposed on them: legal order, religious order. All of them have to deal with the complexities of mass human social living. In other words, the infrastructures that lead to sewerage and water supplies and all the rest. They all seem to be militaristic. They have a very strong propensity of heading towards patriarchal systems of male domination, hierarchical domination, a priestly king or whatever. So there are certain elements that seem to appear again and again. So that's going to be framed. This story of the civilizational journey, you could say, of humanity is going to be something that, of course, occupies a lot of the world history of this course. And it's going to be framed through our relationship with energy. How do we create an energy supply, and what do we do with the surplus, and so on. That leads to levels of complexity and social order. And then what do we do? How do we learn our way through this? And these are very interesting stories to do with language, thinking, philosophy, and ways of problem solving at a communal level. So questions, not answers, are what we're really interested in here. And I'm going to tell you why. There's an interesting tension between questions and answers. Questions open things up. How come human civilization in, let's say, Central and Western Asia, Mesopotamia, the Egyptians, civilization in China, civilization in the Americas, how come they all have similar patterns? It's a good question. How come we seem to build pyramids wherever we go, of one kind or another? These are interesting questions, and they elicit partial responses. Answers things, close things down. If you say it's because human beings think geometrically or spatially, and for pyramids that is, and therefore we create pyramids wherever we go, that immediately goes, end of, well, we've solved that one, that's easy, let's keep moving. No, I think we need to dwell, we need to reflect, and we need to formulate responses. And that's what historians do. So point that I'm going to read this to you. You might be in a car driving along, so it's worth going through this because this is where we're starting. I'm making the assumption that you're first year students, or perhaps second year, or that you've come to the humanities. You're an accounting or medical student, not nursing or someone who's come from another area, and this is perhaps your first foray into the humanities and history. This guy says something really interesting. Many students enter college believing there is a single right answer authorities should tell them. I am giving you the answer. This is the answer for this question. And this is because of the way many of us are educated in schools. You know, we have tests and you get ticked right, wrong, and that sort of stuff. These students see the world in binaries, right and wrong, good and bad, okay? As students progress through their college years, okay, their ways of knowing become increasingly more relativistic. That means could be this, could be that, you know. Hitler had something going here, but he was deeply mistaken there, type of thing. So we could understand what it was that motivated Hitler, the German people, what it is that promotes anti-Semitism or just the use of violence in politics and so on. We start getting an understanding of murkiness around that. That's relativism. How things are constructed out of context. You know, there was centuries and millennia of anti-Semitic activity in Europe, in Christian Europe, because Christians had a grudge against the Jews, okay? You look at the New Testament to see how that's played out in the various Gospels and how the Jews are represented. So they were set up as, you know, as fall guys, in inverted commas, you could say. So that's the constructed, and of course it's also the contextual stuff that they're talking about here. And then the author concludes, they move away, you students that is, move away from thinking there is always a single right answer and begin to see that determining what is right requires analysis of relevant evidence. Historians love their data and their evidence, and looking at them in the light of the context in which we find those people, those human beings, making decisions and choices. Our context right now is incredibly complex, but we can't fool ourselves that, let's say, the human beings leading into the Black Death period, or the Chinese people facing the Mongol invasions of Genghis Khan and so on, that their worlds were not complex too. Humans create a mess. Socially and culturally, we create mess. Historians, one of the things that we try to do is make some sense out of that mess. So don't go looking for answers, please, but ask questions and start developing the skills to make useful responses based on evidence and data. Critical questioning of who gains from this perspective, who loses, where are the winners and losers in history? Of course, it's the winners write the history, we often say. It's a common cliche. But, you know, these are questions also for problematizing the historical process. And I'm into making things a mess myself, because human beings make a mess, I've just said that, so that you can start actually getting into gear for thinking global history, world history, big history. So, point to make, the past is a foreign country, they do things differently there, yes. Even, you know, the Australia of 1950 or 60, or the Australia of your parents, you know, is a vastly different place to now. COVID is just the latest ingredient of complexity. Context, this course, what do? We seek to make a sense of of humanity over time in relationship with the whole. Well, the whole is the context, and ultimately world history in context, that fabulous article from David Christian that you have hopefully read, but certainly need to read because the first assessment is built around it. The whole context ultimately is the cosmological context. Okay, the cosmos has been expanding since the Big Bang, and some of the processes are analogous to social processes around energy, around complexity. And once we get life, particularly, and social life, collective learning. As the whole cosmos expands from the Big Bang to now, it changes and goes through different stages, and each stage is unique and incorporates what has come before. So each stage crosses a threshold, a very key term in this course, a threshold of complexity. Many of the signs or symptoms of threshold change are exhibited through stress, confusion, disorientation, the kind of thresholds that have been experienced if we look at life changes, in terms of organic life, moving from single cell through to complex cell to vertebrates, invertebrates, the dinosaurs, post-dinosaurs, the stress that was obviously created by the comet hitting Earth 65 million years ago, and so on. So there's a lot of things, and we're under a huge amount of stress now, which is suggesting to many world historians, and big historians particularly, that we might be at another threshold, which they are calling threshold 9. The course you'll end up 13 weeks or 14 weeks from now shipwrecked on threshold 9, because that's one of the last readings for this course is around this question of threshold 9. What do we see right now? Okay, here we have cosmic epochs, okay? We can see from the Big Bang to now, radiation, dark ages, stars, galaxies, dark ages ending, and, you know, where the sun, the earth, and the solar system are formed. I've got an even more detailed image of that shortly, so I'm going to come back to that image. So there's this moving out, and increasing complexity is part of each one of those stages in the evolution of the cosmos, but also very clearly in the evolution of human society. So big history, that brings us to big history, because I do draw a lot on big history. David Christian, when he wrote that article in 2003, he was writing it in the shadow of a book that was about to come out, his book, Maps of Time. So have you checked out Big History yet? There's a live link again here. Go and check it out. Look up the Big History Project that's run by Macquarie University and so on. If you're an educator, and I know plenty of teachers take this course, or, you know, aspiring teachers, what I say, this is an area that you can actually really get your teeth into. There's a huge amount of curriculum development going on in this area now. So if you want to understand the story around the pyramids of Egypt, let's say, that's why the picture's there, you will find that ultimately it all begins with the environment of Egypt itself, okay? Believe it or not, 13,000 years ago, the Sahara was a green, open land, okay? It was a different landscape. You had hippopotami, giraffe, all the likely suspects of sub-Saharan Africa, and there are rock carvings and drawings and so on that illustrate all of this all across the Sahara. So the Sahara starts to dry up, and it forces human beings to change their patterns, okay? So it is a story of energy. That's the resources available. They start declining, resources start declining, complexity. Well, what do we do with a new complex situation? Well, human beings at that stage, all they could do was move. In the face of climate change, sea level rise and so on, we're going to see large displacements over this century of human populations. Where are they going to go? Well, they're going to have to go where it's not wet for a start. They're going to have to go inland. So that's something to think about. So it's also a story of collective learning. I'm going to spend more time looking at the Green Sahara in, I think it is the next lecture, because it's a very useful exemplar for illustrating what human beings do and the level of continuity, and also the ways that discontinuity puncture historical processes. Okay. Where are we? Well, we're in a new era many are calling the Anthropocene. That's a live link. You can go there and have a look at the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene is basically saying we've left the Holocene, which is the sort of warm, moist climate period that has sort of been the experience of human beings and hominids as we've evolved over the last 6 to 10 million years. And we're now entering an era, should I say, of great disruption, climatic disruption, major shifts, and so on. The planet has seen many major shifts in climate before. This one is unusual because the scientific evidence is pretty conclusive that we have contributed dramatically to the acceleration of these changes and to the way that these changes are being expressed. The melting of the polar ice caps is just one example. All right. So here we are in the Anthropocene. It's another global experience, hence again, global history, global citizenship is on the agenda. Courses, academic inquiry itself actually reflects the concerns and interests of the people at the time. It's no surprise that in the 19th century, historians were not writing national and nationalist histories, colonial histories and so on, because that was the dominant focus. Throughout the 20th century, up until about the 1970s or 80s, history was more ideologically framed. Marxist history versus neoliberal or liberal histories and so on. There was a lot of focus on individuals because the cult of the individual, so biography, and I love biography. It was one of the first things that I started reading when I was a kid was biographies. But, you know, biography is very much a historical practice that's not out of fashion. You know, we still get, but we have more populist journalist type biographies now, as opposed to historical biographies. It's more likely to get a biography of Bill Gates or, you know, Vladimir Putin today, written by some journalists and so on, than it is that you're going to get a biography on Ivan the Terrible or Julius Caesar. So, yeah, this is worth thinking about. But today, you know, history is changing its focus. We've got gendered history, we've got environmental history, we've got post-colonial histories, and so on. We've got also historians fighting back revisionist histories, where we're saying the white guys coming to Australia weren't so bad, actually, and so on. So we've got, you know, different forms of, you could say, ideological struggle, but also very different concerns by historians today. So that's one of the reasons why that gave birth, or one of the processes that gave birth to this course and this strand of history, big history, world history. On the wrong screen. Here we go. Okay. So history is also contested. That means that, as I've just suggested, you know, there are multiple ways of thinking history. This is just a little snippet from a very interesting little article online looking at DNA in India. So I'm a great fan of DNA as a way of describing the human experience and the hominid experience, because so much of history in the past has been about framing human local variation, differences, Chinese history, Japanese history, Indian history, Malaysian history, Australian history, Indigenous Australian history, American history, the history of the world wars, one or two, the history of an economic system like capitalism, social histories and so on. But DNA helps us actually say, okay, look, if we study DNA, we can see much higher levels of similarity than we will ever see of difference. So this one here, though, is interesting because India is going through quite a tough time, of course, COVID-wise, but it's also a tough time because I have to say the Indian leadership is misguided, and that's being kind, or downright criminal, that's probably being honest, in many respects, not only just in neglecting the suffering of people, but also fomenting division. We've become, given the pressures of globalization, successful politics is now often based on divide and rule again, where, let's say, white Australia and white Australian politicians appear to our conservative white population to the fears that motivate those people, I'm one of them actually, but, you know, I wouldn't be a conservative voter, but, you know, I can see and understand the fears of my generation, particularly in the face of global change. And, you know, I can see how it is conservative politics has made it very difficult for anybody, very brave or challenging in actual fact, to say, no, we're not going to send boat people off to the islands and so on, and offshore them. Similarly, in India, a right-wing nationalist Hindu politics is now being played out, which is, in Indian terms, is quite violent, you know. And what they're saying is that there's sort of like a core Hindu quality to being Indian, whereas this particular research is pointing out that India is more diverse genetically than the entirety of Europe. So that's very interesting, but also there are reasons for this, and those reasons are to do with the amount of time human beings have spent in the Indian subcontinent. Human beings, or the Indigenous Australians, use the Indian subcontinent as, you know, as their pathway as they Africa through India and across to the New Guinea and Indonesia, and then down into Australia some 60, 50,000 years ago. And the genetic evidence is there now to demonstrate that this was so. But what do we have here? Well, the longer populations are in an area, the more diverse their genetics tends to be. what they've discovered looking at DNA of Indigenous Australians is that West Australian Indigenous people have not met Eastern Australian Indigenous people for maybe 30,000 years or something like that. Incredible amounts of time of separation. Separation leads to genetic diversity, right? Anyway, I just want to bring that up because another way of thinking about the relevance of global citizenship today is to understand the forces that are seeking to divide and the identities of people so that to the political advantage of, I would say, short-sighted political interests, economic interests, social interests, class interests, caste interests, as in the case of India. Let's keep moving. So what's my approach then to thinking through this? It's to look at data, everything from genes through information, what the genes tell us, through to knowledge, and ultimately to some kind of historical wisdom. Okay, and this is all about historical literacy. One of my generation's main complaints about young people is they don't know their past, they don't know their history, and so on. I often, have fun when I meet some of you, and I'm going to say, tell me about the Greek myths, or, who's this character out of the Bible, or, what's Shakespeare talking about here, or whatever it might be. There's a whole journey, a voyage of discovery for you folk, many of whom don't have the level of historical literacy that was just part of the worldview of people. I'm 62, right? So, I grew up in the 60s and the 70s, and, certainly it was a very conservative political environment. Menzies was still in control. But, my family valued cultural literacy, which is part of this historical literacy stuff. So I grew up in a well-read family and so on, and I've taken that forward into my own scholarship and my own personal interests and passions. But for many of you, the way that history is done and the social media that you live in, you're more likely to go to Vox or something on the internet, YouTube-wise, to get your historical information, and it's rather bitsy and all over the place. So one of the things that I encourage you to do, and Gil and Rosie and I are all going to work on, is, helping, I guess, encourage you to grow your historical general knowledge in a way that can facilitate and feed in as data and information to help grow your historical knowledge and wisdom. So David Christian notes in passing in the reading for next week, week one of the aims of world history is to see the history of human beings as a single coherent story, rather than as a collection of particular stories, okay, different communities. It's important. And I'm going to flick back to this guy for a moment. And the story starts with data. The story uses data to create information, but a story really rests and resonates at the level of knowledge and perhaps even wisdom, okay? So we've got three big ideas. I've already asked you in my previous little recording to go and look at them on the what's it called, Getting Started page, but also obviously you're going to read about them in David Christian's own work, and we're going to be exploring these next week in our tutorial when we look at that first week's reading. So we're making sense with maps, okay? And I spoke about maps, and I waved my big book around, Terra Incognita, which is just down there next to me. It's about making sense of our own historical predicament today. The past informs the present. The confusions of the present are found in confusions and contestations of the past. This is really important to understand. Historians, one of the things we're tasked with, I guess, is to do some sense making, to provide coherence at various levels. Now, that coherence can be at the global level, like David Christian suggesting, but it can also be coherence at the national level, let's say as Australian history. Well, what is it? Well, we can't deny any longer, if you look at the data, that white Australians are complicit, and we're benefiting today from genocide of Indigenous Australians, conducted all the way through the 19th century, and more surreptitiously in the 20th century via the stolen generation processes, and and the forms of structural violence that still inform many of our policies today, and we're unaware of it. It's not that we're bad guys, most of us. But we're made comfortable by an Australia, which is an extraordinary country to live in. We live in one of the most blessed countries on the planet in many respects. But that doesn't mean that it's a clean country, that we have a nice linear, clear history. We have to embrace the shadow of our own histories as well. So let's move on. So we have myths and theories, both sense-making tools. We have creation myths, the Big Bang. Christian says in the opening pages of this book here, you can pull it off the shelf if you go and get yourself a second-hand copy or a new copy. It's a brilliant book. He says, look, big history is still dealing with creation stories, with myths, but these myths have a huge amount of data behind them. Historians do not create fictions. We are not fantasy writers. Though some historians can be guilty of fantasy. Historians who say, for instance, that the Holocaust is, there's no evidence for the Holocaust or whatever. Holocaust denial is a malicious fantasy. All right? But we have our creation myths. And currently, the one that works for this course, it comes through the voice of science, and science gives us meaning to the cosmic story that I just gave you the quick snapshot of before. The task of history is to understand the present as a chance set of elements or variables, okay, that are the result of constant experiment. We are part of an experiment, a planetary experiment now, in complexity and collective learning particularly, and the question of how do we make energy that is sustainable as opposed to corrosive and destroying the actual basis of life on this planet. Here we have I think a more nuanced and thoughtful map. Again, it's linked. You must have seen that pop up then. But what I just want to say here, because we're getting close to the end of this lecture, is that, each stage, we've got threshold 1, threshold 2, threshold 3, threshold 4. Each one of those stages is linked to a form of knowledge. Okay? Cosmology is the story, is the form of knowledge that gives us the Big Bang. Carl Sagan, who long since dead, okay, Saint Carl, he's a fantastic guy, and particularly beloved of people who love world history. He is a cosmologist. So they give us the sort of coherent story, the Eric Chasson story that David Christian draws upon quite heavily, of course, in that first reading. Then we get to the stars lighting up and we get new chemicals. So stars not lighting up as astrophysics. Then we have, or physics in general. Then we have the chemical elements. Well, that's the discipline of chemistry. Then we have Earth and the solar system. Well, that's the discipline of geology, okay? Then we have the life on Earth. That's the discipline of biology. And then we have collective learning over here, threshold 6. That's where we come in, the humanities, whether it's archaeology, paleoanthropology, anthropological biology, and of course, history. Particularly history picks up once we get agriculture. Why? Because people started writing things. History is very much a text-based thing. And then we have the modern revolution. Well, that's where we get sociology and political theory and those disciplines and so on. So each stage of this evolutionary tale that I'm telling you, it links up with ways of knowing. And that's really important. So that's where we end up here. So ways of knowing need to be organized and structured. And that means that there is a curriculum in here. It's also explicitly laid out for you in the course outline. All right. Tasks, the assessment tasks are here. And, you've got to write an essay for us in the next 5 or 6 weeks from now. Okay, and it's basically an interpretive essay that asks you to make sense of and tell us what you got out of the David Christian article that's reading for week 1. A whole bunch of quizzes will come online at the opening of week 2, and those quizzes are multiple choice. Each quiz is worth 3 points. 10 quizzes overall. If you're any good at math, you'll know that's 30 points all up. Okay, so there's 30 points on the essay, 30 points for the quiz, and then you've got a lovely cracker of an exam at the end of the semester which will involve some short answers and some longer sort of essay type response as well. Each one of these we're going to go into in more detail. Right now, I just want to point out that, you know, the essay is going to be your first port of call. I'm assuming that probably 60, 70, 80% of you have been writing essays up until you get to this point, you know, through high school and so on. Some of you may never have written an essay, or may not have written an essay for 30, 40 years. There's mature age students there. We're going to be spending quite a bit of time looking at that. I want to point out that the rubric for this assessment is already available to you. And if you're one of those people who likes to compare and contrast, you're going to notice that I have simplified the assessment criteria to 4 points. There are 6 in the course outline, but I wanted to make the focus for you and your writing simpler than that, and so I've taken the liberty of throwing 2 of them out or consolidating them. And again, Rosie and Gil and I are going to talk about those next week when we see you, and we'll be focusing on what they mean for you in your practice as emerging historians. Yeah, so the online quiz comes up next week. Sorry, week 2, should I say? So, and you know, I'm recording this lecture now in the week before week 1, and I'll be trying to do that each time so that you get at least a few days head start on having a listen to whatever it is that I'm going to say. I'm going to break these recordings up into focus recordings, 20 minutes on this, 30 or 40, whatever I've done now. I'm not even sure how long I've been going for, probably at least 30 minutes, I'd say, if not 40. Yeah, so you get about an hour, maybe a bit more sometimes, of what we call asynchronous. That means you can watch it whenever you like, material to support our face-to-face work in the tutorials. Knowing that face-to-face at any time with COVID around could become online. Rosie's group is already online. Some of you have chosen to be online from the start. So Rosie will be working with those. She's an expert at the online environment, having worked with that last year with me as well. In fact, both Rosie and Gil are long-term travellers with me in this. It's kind of like a collective party, really. I don't ever feel that I own the course on my own. I would always consider Gil and Rosie as co-creators for this course. So, and you'll find that if you don't have me as your tutor, you're not going to be in any way shortchanged. You're probably actually better off. I would suggest that, you know, you're going to have a great time. It's a great course. It will stretch your thinking. It will push you into new spaces for most of you. Most students tell me that, wow, it did my head in at the beginning, but gee, I came through loving it. That's my personal pitch, but it's also quite true in actual fact. So I'm going to end here, pull this down so I can end the recording, and I look forward to seeing you, my guys, in my tute next week. And I can say on behalf of Gil and Rosie that they are also keen and eager to get started with the semester. Take care. Enjoy this lovely weekend. I've been freezing up here. I live up behind Mullaney, so it's been quite cold up here. And but yeah, it's all part of the course, isn't it? Take care and best wishes.